Judge Richard Thompson sat behind the worn wooden bench, feeling the weight of another busy day ahead. The courtroom was bustling with the usual noise as lawyers shuffled papers and clients anxiously whispered to their attorneys. Today was no different from any other as far as he was concerned. He had cases to get through, decisions to make, and people to judge. Some were routine and some required more attention, but in the end it was all the same. He would make his ruling and the court would move on with its business. At least that was how he saw it. Maya Jenkins walked into the courtroom with quiet confidence, her heels clicking on the hard floor as she approached the defendant's table. She wasn't intimidated by the long rows of seats or the judge sitting high on his bench. She had seen it all before, having worked in public service for years. She was accustomed to the harshness of the system, but she had also learned how to navigate it with grace. She stood tall and composed as her case was called. Her file was presented before the judge, and she stepped forward, ready to explain herself. Judge Thompson glanced up at her, but only briefly. He quickly returned to the paperwork in front of him as he skimmed over the details of her case. A parking violation, he thought to himself. He didn't even need to hear her explanation. It was one of those simple cases that didn't require much thought, just a fine and a quick resolution, nothing complicated. He didn't even bother to look at her properly, yet he could feel her gaze on him, waiting for him to pass judgment. Maya spoke clearly, her voice steady, as she explained that she had parked in a spot designated for special needs. Unaware of the restriction, she had seen no visible signs and thought the area was a regular parking space. When the officer issued the ticket, she had been taken aback, but she accepted the mistake she had made. She wasn't trying to get out of paying the fine, but she wanted the judge to understand that it had been an honest error. Judge Thompson didn't look up as he heard her words. He was already making his decision in his mind. A simple violation, a straightforward fine, no need to waste time on pleasantries. He interrupted her with a wave of his hand. And before she could finish her explanation, he spoke firmly and with finality, stating that the fine would stand. Maya felt a wave of frustration surge within her, but she held herself together. She had dealt with this before, the dismissive attitudes of people who thought they could judge her based on nothing more than her appearance. She stood silently as the judge banged his gavel, the sound echoing in the courtroom, signifying the end of the case. She had been fined, and there was nothing more to be said. But as she turned to leave the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was yet another instance where someone had made an assumption about her based on the way she looked or the way she presented herself. It was a feeling she had known her whole life, and though she didn't let it show, she couldn't deny the sting of being dismissed so easily. As she walked out of the courtroom, Maya's mind raced. She had been polite, she had explained herself, but it hadn't mattered to the judge. He had already made up his mind, and that was that she wasn't sure what bothered her more, the fine or the fact that her words had been ignored. She could feel the anger simmering beneath her composed exterior, but she knew that reacting in the moment wouldn't do her any good. She would pay the fine, but she wouldn't forget what had happened here today. Maya's steps were measured as she left the courthouse, but inside, she was seething. The fine didn't bother her as much as the way she had been treated in that sterile, cold room. Judge Thompson had barely looked at her, his mind already made up before she had even opened her mouth. It wasn't about the parking violation. It was the fact that her voice had been silenced, her explanation dismissed as if it didn't matter. She had been expecting a fair hearing, a simple recognition of her good faith mistake. But instead, she had been treated like another faceless defendant. As she walked down the steps of the courthouse, the sun was shining, but it did nothing to lift her mood. The world seemed indifferent to her frustration, just as Judge Thompson had been. Maya had grown used to this feeling. It wasn't the first time she had been dismissed or overlooked, but each instance still managed to sting. She had learned to wear a mask of composure in public, to hide the anger and disappointment that simmered just beneath the surface. It was easier to keep the peace than to confront every slight, but today felt different. Maya took a deep breath as she stepped into her car. The engine hummed to life, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She knew she could pay the fine without a second thought. Money wasn't an issue, but the principle of the matter was what burned inside her. How many times had she faced this before? How many times had she been judged for the color of her skin or the way she carried herself? She didn't make a scene, she didn't argue in court, and yet she had been treated as though her presence was an inconvenience. Her thoughts drifted to her career. She had worked tirelessly to get where she was, to earn the respect of her colleagues, to climb the ranks. As a senior executive in a major city department, Maya had spent years breaking down barriers, proving herself in spaces where she had always been one of the few black women at the table. She had learned how to navigate the system, how to fight for what was right without losing herself in the process. But today, she felt that old familiar sting of being invisible, of being underestimated, of being judged by appearances alone. Maya glanced at the time on her dashboard. She still had a few hours before her next meeting, and the thought of facing a room full of colleagues after what had just happened made her feel a little exhausted. But she had no choice. She couldn't let this moment define her. She had worked too hard to let some random court decision derail her day or, worse, her sense of self. She thought about how to proceed. The fine was a nuisance, but what truly bothered her was the feeling of being powerless. That powerlessness was something she hadn't felt in years. She knew she had to take control of the situation in some way. As she made her way to the office, the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. She wasn't going to let some judge, no matter how high his position, continue to look down on her. She had to remind herself that she was in a place of power too, and she had earned every ounce of it. Maya parked her car and walked into the building, the weight of the situation still heavy on her shoulders. But as she walked through the halls toward her office, she made a decision. She would take this injustice and turn it into an opportunity for change. The judge hadn't just dismissed her in that courtroom. He had shown a complete lack of awareness. And Maya knew that it was time to make him aware, not through anger, but through something far more powerful, understanding. Maya's day was far from over. As soon as she entered her office, she was greeted by her assistant, who handed her a pile of reports and meeting agendas. Maya didn't mind the paperwork. She thrived in the chaos of her job, managing a large city department that dealt with countless public services. There was always something to do, a new challenge to tackle. But today, her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom, to Judge Richard Thompson's condescending tone and the way he had dismissed her without even trying to understand. She buried the thought as she sifted through the stack of papers, setting aside some for later review. One particular document caught her eye, a memo for an upcoming city council meeting. Maya read the names of the high-ranking officials listed for the meeting, including city managers, department heads, and even judges who were involved in governmental affairs. Her eyes skimmed the names, expecting nothing unusual, until she saw one name that made her pause: Judge Richard Thompson. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the page. Her first instinct was disbelief. Could it really be the same judge? Maya hadn't thought much about him after the courtroom encounter. After all, he was just another public servant to her. But seeing his name on this official document, it hit her like a bolt of lightning. He was scheduled to attend the same high-level meeting where she would be presiding. Maya leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. She had to admit she was stunned. She had assumed Judge Thompson was just another figure in the legal system, someone who worked in a completely different realm. But now she realized that not only was he in the same professional network, but he also worked on matters of government affairs, matters that, as the head of a major department, she had a significant stake in. She controlled large projects, shaped policies, and worked with numerous city leaders on a daily basis. And here was this judge, someone who had just fined her in court, suddenly part of her world in a way she hadn't anticipated. She scrolled through the rest of the memo, her eyes lingering on the details. There it was again. Judge Richard Thompson, Special Hearing Officer for Government Affairs *. Maya couldn't help but laugh bitterly to herself. Of all the people in the city, of all the departments and leaders she interacted with, it had to be him. The same man who had treated her like just another faceless defendant, who had assumed that her explanation was irrelevant, was now about to cross paths with her again. But this time, things would be different. Maya thought for a moment about how she wanted to handle this. Part of her wanted to confront him directly, to remind him of the fine he had imposed and how unjust it had felt. Another part of her wanted to be more strategic, to let the situation unfold naturally and see how he reacted once he realized who she was. She could use this moment to show him that she wasn't just a woman to be dismissed or overlooked. She was someone with authority, someone who could influence decisions that mattered far more than the fine he had issued. For the rest of the day, Maya focused on her work, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the thought of Judge Thompson. She couldn't believe the irony. This man, who had shown no regard for her in that courtroom, was now about to be her colleague in a high-stakes government meeting. And she would make sure he knew it. The power dynamic had shifted. When the time came for the meeting, Maya would be ready. She wouldn't let this opportunity slip by. She'd show him, and everyone else in the room, that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. The next few days flew by, and before Maya knew it, the much-anticipated city council meeting had arrived. She stood in front of the large conference table, looking over the room filled with high-ranking officials, department heads, and city planners. It was a crucial meeting, one where citywide policies would be discussed, and where her expertise and leadership were expected to guide the conversation. She glanced at the attendees, mentally preparing herself to steer the discussion in the right direction. But then, as her eyes scanned the room, her gaze landed on someone unexpected, Judge Richard Thompson. He was seated near the front, flipping through some papers, his demeanor calm and composed. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She had known he would be there, but seeing him in person again, after the court incident, felt surreal. For a moment, everything around her seemed to slow down. The sharp contrast between the man who had been so dismissive in the courtroom and the professional, composed figure sitting at the table now was striking. She took a deep breath, gathering herself. She couldn't let this disrupt her focus. This was her space, her domain, and she would not let the ghost of that courtroom experience shadow her authority. But as the meeting began, she couldn't help but notice that Judge Thompson seemed particularly aware of her presence. He glanced at her briefly, and she could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was subtle, but she wasn't imagining it. Maya proceeded with the meeting, seamlessly presenting the issues at hand and guiding the discussion forward. As she spoke, she felt the weight of the judge's gaze on her, and though she refused to let it affect her, a part of her couldn't shake the idea that there was something lingering between them. For the first time in her career, she felt a strange power dynamic at play, one that she had never experienced before. Judge Thompson, on the other hand, was noticeably uncomfortable. He sat upright, his hands folded on the table, occasionally scribbling notes, but always keeping his eyes trained on Maya as she spoke. She could sense his unease. It wasn't just because of her position in the meeting. It was because in that moment he realized that the person he had dismissed in the courtroom was now the one leading the room. He wasn't in control anymore. After the main presentation, the floor was open for discussion. Maya carefully navigated the conversation, calling on various officials and answering questions with confidence. Every now and then her eyes would meet Judge Thompson's, and she could see the tension building in him. He was no longer the authority figure behind the bench. He was just another member of the board, equal to everyone else. It wasn't until the end of the meeting that the two of them found themselves alone in the conference room. The others had filed out, and only Maya and the judge remained, both silently acknowledging the awkwardness of the situation. Maya had decided she would not let this go unresolved. She had to address the past, to make it clear that she was not someone to be overlooked again. "Judge Thompson," Maya began, her voice calm but firm. He looked up at her, his face slightly flushed, as if he had been caught in some internal struggle. "I think we need to talk about what happened in the courtroom." Thompson swallowed, his eyes darting around as if searching for the right words. He had been expecting this conversation, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. I owe you an apology, Ms. Jenkins," he stammered. "I had no idea who you were when you were in my courtroom, and I regret how I handled things." Maya nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't want to accept his apology right away. She needed him to understand the gravity of his mistake first. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty, Judge," she said, her tone measured but firm. "But I want you to understand that how you treated me in court wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was dismissive. It was a reflection of something deeper, something systemic. The judge's face softened as he realized the weight of her words. He nodded slowly, clearly grappling with the uncomfortable truth of what had just been revealed to him. "I understand," he said, his voice quieter now, more humble. "And I'll do better. I promise you that." Maya studied him for a moment before responding. "I believe you. But it's going to take more than a promise. It's going to take a change in how we both approach our work." The judge met her eyes and nodded again, his posture slumping as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. There was something about this encounter, something that would shift both of their perspectives in ways neither of them could yet fully understand. As Maya left the room, her mind was already turning to the future. She had made her point, but this was only the beginning. The real work was still ahead. As Maya walked out of the meeting room, she felt a sense of accomplishment, though it wasn't the kind she expected. Confronting Judge Thompson had been a necessary step, but it was more than just a simple apology. What had transpired in that room had been a turning point, not just for him, but for her as well. She had managed to maintain her professionalism, showing him the respect he had denied her in court, while also demanding acknowledgement of the system's deep flaws. The encounter with Thompson weighed heavily on her throughout the day. It was rare that Maya had the opportunity to speak so candidly with someone in power, let alone a judge, but she knew that her words had been effective. He had not only apologized, but he seemed genuinely aware of the significance of what she'd said. She wasn't just some woman in his courtroom, she was someone with a voice, with power, and someone who was going to hold him accountable. Maya sat at her desk, reviewing the stack of reports that had been left for her, but her thoughts kept wandering back to the moment in the boardroom. Thompson had seemed almost human. She had expected defensiveness, but instead, she'd found vulnerability. There was a part of her that understood. He wasn't entirely to blame for the dismissive behavior he had shown in court. He had grown accustomed to wielding his power in a way that insulated him from the experiences of others, particularly women of color. Maya knew that his life had likely shielded him from the realities she faced daily. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason. By the time the workday ended, Maya had made up her mind. She couldn't just leave things there. This interaction had opened a door, and it was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. She decided to reach out to Thompson, not just to settle the past, but to begin a conversation about change, about how the systems they both worked within could evolve. Maya composed an email, carefully worded yet direct. She suggested they meet again, this time outside of the formalities of the boardroom, where they could talk candidly about the challenges facing their respective roles. She didn't expect an immediate change in his behavior, but she knew the conversation needed to be started. She hit send and hoped he would be willing to continue the dialogue. The following morning, an email appeared in her inbox. It was from Thompson. The subject line read, *Gray, meeting request *. Maya opened it, her eyes scanning quickly over the contents. He had agreed to meet. His response was straightforward, acknowledging that they had much to discuss, and he had suggested a quiet cafe near the courthouse. Maya smiled to herself. He had taken the first step toward genuine growth. Later that week, Maya arrived at the cafe, her mind racing with the possibilities of the conversation that lay ahead. She had been a part of enough meetings and negotiations to know that this wouldn't be a simple discussion, but she was prepared. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about forging a new understanding, about shifting the paradigm in a way that allowed people to see each other as equals, regardless of position or background. When Judge Thompson arrived, he was dressed casually, his posture more relaxed than she had ever seen. Maya couldn't help but notice the slight shift in his demeanor. There was a sincerity in his approach, a recognition that their earlier encounter had opened up something much larger than a simple apology. They sat down, and before either of them spoke, Thompson broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "And I know I have a long way to go, but I want to understand more. I want to do better." Maya took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where change could begin. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "But it's not enough to just understand, Judge. We need to look at what needs to change, how we can create a more inclusive environment, not just for people like me, but for everyone who's been overlooked." For the first time, Maya saw Thompson truly listening, not just to her words, but to the message behind them. She knew that this conversation was just the beginning, but it felt like a real shift, a change in the making. Over the next few weeks, Maya and Judge Thompson continued to meet regularly. Each conversation brought them closer to a deeper understanding of the issues that had shaped both their lives. It was an unlikely friendship, born from a confrontation in a courtroom, but they both felt the significance of their discussions. Maya had known from the beginning that change wouldn't happen overnight, but each small shift in perspective mattered. At their meetings, Maya spoke openly about her experiences, about the biases and assumptions she had encountered over the years. She explained how the legal and governmental systems were often blind to the struggles of those who didn't fit the mold, how people like her, women of color, were often dismissed, underestimated, and even silenced. She didn't expect Thompson to fix everything, but she needed him to understand. Judge Thompson, for his part, listened more attentively than he ever had in the past. He had grown up in a world where power and privilege were the norm, where he had never questioned the systems that had worked in his favor. It wasn't until he met Maya that he realized how much he had taken for granted. His position as a judge, his authority. He had never thought about how those things affected the people he ruled over. "I never saw it that way," Thompson admitted one afternoon as they sat in a small cafe, the quiet hum of conversation filling the space around them. "I've always been taught that the law is objective, that the facts are the only things that matter. But the truth is, the law doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's shaped by the biases and assumptions of the people who enforce it." Maya nodded, her eyes steady. "Exactly. And when those biases go unchecked, it creates a system that isn't just flawed, it's dangerous. People like me, people from communities that are often ignored, we don't get the same opportunities to be heard. And when we do speak up, we're often dismissed or silenced." Thompson's expression softened as he took in her words. "I can see how my behavior in court was part of that problem. I wasn't listening to you. Not really. I thought I was above it, above everything you were saying. I thought my position gave me a pass on understanding. I was wrong." Maya could feel his sincerity, and it made her hopeful, though she knew the journey wouldn't be easy. Changing a mindset, particularly one as ingrained as Thompson's, was no small feat. But she wasn't asking for him to be perfect. She was asking for him to try. And so far he had. As their meetings progressed, Maya and Thompson began to brainstorm ideas for reform. They spoke about initiatives that could be implemented within the judicial system to address racial biases, about ways to ensure that those who appeared in court had access to a fair and impartial hearing. Maya even suggested that they work together on a public awareness campaign aimed at educating the public on the importance of fair treatment under the law. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting, Thompson turned to Maya with a smile. "You know, I never imagined this is where we end up, but I'm glad we did." Maya chuckled, feeling a sense of camaraderie she hadn't anticipated. "Me neither. But sometimes you have to shake things up to make real change." They had both learned from each other. Maya had gained a new appreciation for the struggles faced by those in power who were willing to confront their own biases. And Thompson, for the first time, saw his position as a judge not as a shield, but as a responsibility to ensure that the law served everyone fairly, not just those who looked like him. Their partnership was still new, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger, something that had the potential to make a real difference in how justice was administered, not just in their city, but in the wider legal community. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, they were both on it together. The months passed, and the partnership between Maya and Judge Thompson flourished in ways neither had anticipated. What began as a single conversation to address a moment of injustice had blossomed into something much larger, a shared mission to challenge systemic biases within the legal system. Together, they developed workshops, collaborated with civil rights groups, and began lobbying for reforms that would make the judicial process more accessible and fair for marginalized communities. Maya had known that this was going to be a slow-moving process, but what she hadn't expected was the pushback. At first, the resistance had come in small ways. Backhanded comments during meetings, eye rolls when they proposed new policies, and the occasional dismissive attitude from colleagues who saw their work as idealistic or unnecessary. But as their efforts gained momentum and their proposals began to make waves, the pushback grew louder. At one of the city council meetings, Maya presented a proposal to allocate funding for more comprehensive training for judges and lawyers on implicit bias, along with the implementation of mandatory community outreach programs. As she spoke, she could feel the tension in the room. Many of the city's veteran leaders had never questioned the fairness of the system, and the idea of addressing biases felt threatening to them. Maya had anticipated the resistance, but she was resolute. She would not be deterred. Judge Thompson had been by her side during every presentation, offering his endorsement and personal testimony. His presence as a respected member of the judicial community lent credibility to their efforts. But Maya couldn't ignore the whispers that circulated behind their backs. There were murmurs about the new agenda they were pushing, about the radical ideas that were being presented. During a particularly heated exchange in a council session, one of the older council members, a long-serving figure in local politics, voiced his concerns. "We don't need to change everything just because some people feel slighted. This is how the system has worked for decades, and it's served us well." His words were met with nods of agreement from others seated at the table. Maya's heart sank, but she didn't let it show. She had spent her entire career in this system, fighting for justice, advocating for change, and now she knew just how hard it was to shift the mindset of those who had always benefited from the status quo. Judge Thompson, sensing the rising opposition, leaned in slightly and spoke up. "With all due respect, Councilman, the system has served some of us well, but not all of us. The status quo has left too many behind. That's why we need to address it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed as though the room was divided, unsure how to proceed. Maya could see the cracks beginning to show. The conversation was shifting, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Back in their private meetings, Maya and Thompson discussed the growing resistance. They knew it was a sign of how deeply entrenched the biases and injustices were within their community, but they also knew they couldn't give up. Their fight was just beginning, and despite the obstacles, their cause was gaining more traction than ever. "We're on the right path," Maya said one evening as they sat in the quiet of Thompson's office, papers and notes scattered across the desk. "But it's going to get worse before it gets better. They'll try to undermine us, try to discredit us. But we can't back down." Thompson nodded, his face resolute. "I've been thinking a lot about that, Maya. There's a long road ahead, and we're just getting started. But you're right, this is bigger than us now. It's about doing what's right, not what's easy." Maya smiled, her resolve strengthening. Together, they would continue the fight. They weren't just confronting biases within the system. They were challenging a way of thinking that had been passed down for generations. And as difficult as it was, they knew that every small victory mattered, even if the path ahead was uncertain. The road to change was long, but Maya and Thompson were determined to walk it side by side, no matter the obstacles they faced. As the months continued to unfold, the work that Maya and Judge Thompson had started began to bear fruit. The city council, once hesitant and resistant, slowly started to shift. The more their proposals gained visibility, the harder it became to ignore the undeniable truth. The system was not as impartial and fair as they had believed. There were cracks, deep ones, and they could no longer be swept under the rug. Maya watched as more colleagues in the legal community began to speak out, acknowledging their own biases and advocating for reform. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but the momentum was building. What once felt like a battle against the tide was now an organized movement, with allies from all corners of the city pushing for change. But even with this progress, Maya couldn't forget the long road it had taken to get here. The insults, the dismissal, the backroom deals that had threatened to stall their efforts, it had all been part of the fight. And yet the most unexpected outcome was how much her relationship with Judge Thompson had grown. In the beginning, Maya had seen him only as the man who had dismissed her in court, the embodiment of the system that had failed so many. But now, months later, she saw him as a true ally, someone who had been willing to confront his own biases and shortcomings. Their conversations had shifted from resistance to collaboration. They had become partners in a way Maya had never imagined. It was during one of their regular check-ins that Thompson looked at her with a reflective expression. "You know, Maya," he said quietly, "I've spent so many years working in this system, thinking I was just doing my job. But what I've learned from you is that my job isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about making sure the law serves everyone fairly, equally." Maya nodded, grateful for his insight. "That's exactly it, Judge. The law can be blind, but it shouldn't be deaf or indifferent." They were sitting in the small conference room at the courthouse, papers spread before them, planning their next steps. The city's new training programs on implicit bias had been implemented, and some of their judicial reforms were being integrated into courtrooms. It wasn't perfect, but the shift was undeniable. Maya and Thompson both knew there was more work to do. The struggle for equality wasn't a destination, it was a journey. But as they looked at each other, there was a sense of hope. They had started something together, something that would ripple through the legal system long after they were gone. A few weeks later, as Maya watched the news from her office, she saw a familiar face on the screen. It was Thompson, giving an interview about the new reforms and his commitment to creating a more equitable legal system. In his words, there was no longer any pretense, no walls to hide behind. It wasn't just about appearances anymore, it was about doing the right thing. As the segment ended, Maya sat back in her chair, a feeling of fulfillment washing over her. She had fought for justice, and she had found an unexpected ally in the process. What began as a confrontation in a courtroom had turned into a partnership that would leave a legacy for future generations. It wasn't just about the reforms they had passed or the programs they had started. It was about the conversations they had begun, the doors they had opened for others to walk through. They had shown that even in a broken system, change was possible. Maya stood up, walking to the window of her office. The city stretched out before her, vibrant and full of life. She knew the road ahead would never be easy, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. They had planted the seeds of change, and now it was time to watch them grow.